How great to have them here. This past Christmas, Melissa and I went to a lot of Christmas parties, but this one in particular was at somebody's home. It's a lovely home, festive. They had soft jazz going across the stereo system integrated into the ceiling. There's sports coats and elbows and tinkling glasses and all of that. And there were pockets of conversation all over the room. There was laughter in this pocket. They were talking about sports closest to me. And in another little conversation group somewhere else in the room, I heard my name mentioned. I don't know what story she was telling. I might have been there at the story she was telling. I might have told her that story and she was mentioning that. I might have been the butt of her joke. I don't know. But across all the noise and the crowd, I heard my name. And you've had that experience too. We know that we hear our name, we recognize it above all others. But you also know that there are some voices we hear above all others. If you're a parent, you know this experience. You're on the playground, there are a dozen children on the playground. From out of that gaggle, you hear mama, and you know whether that voice was your child or not. Right? You are conditioned to hear that voice over all of the other voices in the grouping. Of course, it's true that the mama voice goes in both directions, right? You heard your own mama's voice above any others too. In the summer nights, afternoons, John Otto and I'd be out in the neighborhood playing. We knew the rule: when the street light goes on, you go home. Sometimes what we were doing was just really, really important, and we didn't. And a short while later, I would hear my mother's voice from the front steps of my house calling me angrily back to the house. And we could be 2 blocks away at Denise Burton's house, and I would still hear my mother's voice across 2 streets because I was conditioned to hear my mother's voice above all the rest. But it's harder, I think, to hear a distinct voice because our world has more noise than ever before. I'm not talking about more planes and more traffic. I'm talking symbolically now. But we are bombarded with so many noises, so many voices that are demanding our attention. There's a guy on TV who really wants me to buy gutters from him, really badly. There's a potential presidential hopeful with shoulder-length blonde hair who's pointing a finger in my face and telling me to wake up to the lies. If you were paying attention, that could be either party. Work on that a minute. My commute down Peachtree, I'm listening to the radio. There's a guy trying to convince me to buy diamonds directly from a diamond importer. And at the same time, I'm watching Baton Bob, who's got on a majorette costume, and he is demanding my attention, and you can bet he is going to get my attention. There is one woman on TV who appears to be in her mid-30s. She is standing on a beach, wind in her hair. She has about convinced me it is better in the Bahamas. There are so many voices that are vying for my attention. But some of the voices, persuasive voices, are competing not just for where I go on vacation or buy diamonds, but competing for how I view the world. For instance, Peter Thiel, one of the co-founders of PayPal, wrote a business book toward the end of 2014. His book's called 0 to 1, Notes on Startups or How to Build the Future. And this is his message, I'm quoting. It is up to us whether or not humanity will exist in the future. Without things we create, the future will not exist. Are you ready to sing with me now? My hope is built on nothing less than my confidence in your startup. In all of the noise, can we still hear Jesus say, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end? Which voice will you hear? This is the central question, isn't it? Who is Jesus, and where does his voice fit in the cacophony of voices calling for our attention? Who is Jesus? Scholar Peter Nichol points out that this question about who is Jesus is a part of the way the writer of Luke is driving the narrative in Luke's gospel. One of the sub-themes going on in Luke's gospel always is, who is this? The Pharisees argue about it. The disciples wonder. John the Baptist puzzles over it. The hometown folks had worried about who this was. Both Herod and Jesus asked it point blank. Who is this man? And right after Jesus asked the disciples point blank, but who do you say that I am? 8 days later, he took Peter, James, and John, went up on the mountain to pray, and while he was praying, we get to this incredible story of the Transfiguration. He's praying, and something happened to his face. It changed. And then his clothes, something happened to his clothes. They started to shine dazzling white, like Moses on Mount Sinai. And speaking of Moses, everybody saw it. Moses was there too. Moses and Elijah talking to Jesus. Their faith's two most revered, most authoritative people in all of Israel's history, and they're right there talking to Jesus about his departure, which was about to happen in Jerusalem. They were talking about Jesus leaving, his departure, in Greek, his exodus. His exodus. I'm saying, if you have Jesus, Moses, and Elijah talking about the next exodus, something big is about to happen. And you've got the representatives of all of holy history right there. Peter, James, and John have been fighting sleep all night, but they're not fighting sleep anymore. They're awake now. They saw it. They saw the three holy figures, and the ever-impetuous Peter jumps up with an idea. Imagine that. Peter's always jumping up with an idea. He says, Jesus, look, Master, it's great for us to be here. Here's what I think we should do. I'll get some tools. We'll build 3 booths right here. We'll make one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Booths, get it? Like the Jewish Feast of the Tabernacle. And then we never have to leave. We can just stay in the magic of this holy moment and this holy company. And while he was saying this, a cloud appeared. A cloud came and overshadowed them. Now, if you're with me, you picked up that they were fighting sleep, so it's nighttime. They were fighting to stay awake. It's in the middle of the night. Hard to get overshadowed by a cloud at night. But a cloud emerged. It enveloped them, and they were terrified. And of course they were terrified, not just because they've been enveloped by a cloud at night, but because they know their Hebrew history. They know that clouds are the symbol of the presence of God. A central scene in their Hebrew story is an earlier scene of Moses when he went up Mount Sinai and a cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord covered the mountain for 6 days, and on the 7th day, the Lord called out to Moses, called out of the cloud. They know that story. At really important places in Israel's history, God has called out of a cloud. The disciples are terrified. They're about to enter the presence of the holy God, and while enveloped in this presence, they hear a voice come out from the cloud. This is my Son, my chosen, my beloved. Listen to him. Well, the question of who is Jesus, at least for these three followers, the ones who were inside this amazing story, it's been answered for them. Who is Jesus? Jesus is the chosen, beloved Son of God. Listen to him. Keep in mind, the voice said this to the first followers of Jesus, which means that even Peter, James, and John had to be reminded to listen to this voice over the clutter of all the other voices. And if they had to be reminded, how much more is that true for us, given the amount of noise out there trying to get our attention? The reminder that the voice of Jesus is not just another voice on another radio station. It's not just the preferred teaching of my moral teacher. The voice of Jesus is not just where one of our allegiances stands, like I'm a Broncos fan, a libertarian, a ballet enthusiast, and a Christian. This is not a call to consider squeezing a little more church in, or an invitation to consider the merits of Orthodox Christianity over competing philosophies. The cloud's presence declared, Jesus is the chosen, beloved Son of God. We are to listen to him. Which means that above every voice of culture or politic, above every voice of society, environment, economics, or party, we listen to him. The voice of Jesus is the voice of the chosen Son of God. What he declares important, we must declare important. You care for and advocate for the same people Jesus cares for and advocates for. You stand for what Jesus stands for. You go where Jesus leads. That's what it means to listen to him. I mentioned, pardon me, I mentioned that I could hear my mother's voice 2 blocks away, but it wasn't because she had a particularly distinctive voice or a particularly loud voice. I could hear it because it was my mother. When Haley and Brendan were on the playground with a dozen other children, and I heard one of them cry out, "Daddy," from inside that group, I knew it was my child that had called out Daddy, because it was my child. I knew the voice because we'd been living together, heartbeat to heartbeat. I knew it because I taught them how to say Daddy. We lived together, ate breakfast together, cuddled up on the sofa together. They knew my voice in the noise, and I knew their voice too. They could hear my voice penetrate through the noise. I could hear theirs, not because we were louder. It was because we were familiar. And we knew how to trust the voice as a voice of love because it was a part of our own pulse, our own heartbeat. We're called to listen to the voice of Jesus. But first we have to be able to recognize it. So many people say to me over the course of a month, I wish I knew God's will for my life right now. Well, the only way we learn to recognize the voice of Jesus is to spend enough time there that we train ourselves to hear his voice above the clamor. It's part of the reason we gather here each week at 9:45 for Sunday school, so we can learn how to listen. It's why we come and worship together, to draw ourselves into a more intimate space with the Christ so that his voice becomes familiar. and we sit alone and we read stories from the Bible, we pray and we listen until the voice comes clear. These are disciplines. Sunday school attendance, corporate worship, private devotion, they're disciplines. Same root word as disciple. But over time, we begin to recognize the voice of Jesus. And when we recognize his voice, sometimes it jolts us because it stands our dominant values on their heads. Because it's a voice that calls us away from selfishness, a voice that calls us to love the unlovely, to give instead of hoard, to care about others first. Sometimes it's a voice we recognize as a call to serve. But at other times, it is the voice of a loving parent reminding us that we are home, we are safe, we are loved. In either case, we will know if it is the voice of Jesus, if we recognize it from being close to it enough, if we live heartbeat to heartbeat with that voice in a way that we know it when it rings true. Listen to him. That voice might be calling you today. It might not be a voice you've heard before. It might be a first-time call into loving relationship with Jesus Christ. That voice might be calling you to join this church, or throw your life into service of Christ right here with us. Might be calling you into a new form of service. If you recognize the voice as being the voice of love, the voice from the cloud said, listen to him. Respond as you feel led as we sing.